Welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a few more seconds as people file in to our Zoom room, newly expanded. See what our attendance is tonight. So we'll get started in just a little while. Welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a few more seconds as people file in to our Zoom room, newly expanded. See what our attendance is tonight. So we'll get started. Just gonna test my sound real quick here. Testing. Might have a little bit of an echo. All right, I think we will go ahead and get started. If Bashan Wright, you want to go ahead and make a few announcements before we roll into the program?
Hi, and welcome to session 2, Racism in Individuals. We previously defined racism, ensuring that we start off on the same footing. Now it's important that we know how racism is carried out by individuals and influences individuals. The goal of session 2, Racism in Individuals, is to answer the question, what is our place, role, and/or relationship to racist ideologies and institutions? And how does this affect us as individuals? We will also focus on policies for dealing with complaints of racism. If you believe this to be abstract, I have personal stories to tell you. Personal stories about academia and the university campus. For example, the university campus is the first place that I was called the N-word. It didn't happen once, it happened twice. The second time, someone threatened to kill me while calling me the N-word. The university campus is the first place I saw a Confederate flag. The university campus is where I came to know racism. My first day of graduate school was the first time that I tried to rent an apartment, went to that apartment, and a white lady came out and she jumped because she had only spoken to me on the phone and she thought that I was white. We're going to talk about racism in individuals, and we're going to talk about the policies that we use to deal with complaints for racism. And with that, I send it over to Casey.
Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and get started with session 2. And I'll be your host. My name is Casey Adderhold. I am an earthquake seismologist working at the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology in Washington, D.C. We have a lot to get to today, so I will jump in first with an introduction of our speakers. If you have questions during their presentations, please put them into the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can towards the end of the program. So Dr. Adrienne Harris is faculty and supervisor at New York University postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. She is on the faculty and is a supervisor at the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. In 2009, Dr. Harris and colleagues established the Sandor Ferenczi Center at the New School University. With her colleague, Louis Aaron, she edits the Relational Book Series, which has published over 60 volumes. She writes about gender and development, about analytic subjectivity, and about the analysts developing and writing around the period of the First World War. Dr. Adrienne Harris will give her presentation on her paper, The Perverse Pact, Racism and White Privilege, and how we should explore our identities within these words. Dr. Harris?
I want to thank you, all of the people at URGE who invited me to talk and who have read this paper. The Perverse Pact is a paper that I started to write perhaps 3 or 4 years ago. It's been published, and I think I'm going to be writing this paper for the rest of my life. And that in every year, practically every few months, I have something new to think about and to take up. The paper is about the place of white persons in systemic racism. And the paradox, even in what I'm going to say today, is that even as many white people are saying, we have to transform something in ourselves, we have to unpack racist ideology, racist practices, racist unconscious. In fact, we are still asking and requiring of Black writers, Black thinkers, that they have to do the work. So when I think about the Perverse Pact and what goes into racist practices, there are a number of people that I'm reading now, even in the aftermath of my paper, who are very important. Frantz Fanon, writing from the 60s on. Fanon talks about the Black body as a phobogenic object, an object of excitement and desire, and an object of danger. And I think Vachon's examples illuminate that over and over again. Sheldon George, who is a contemporary professor of English and is writing about trauma and race, uses the concept of Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, of jouissance. That is, there is in white persons reactivity to people of color, jouissance, which is the concept of desire and hatred, desire and destructiveness. And I think that these elements in racist practice of excitement and danger and our inability to face this as white persons remains, I think, one of the single most important aspects of racism for us to unpack. I started to write the paper when I was invited to a conference on racism. And without realizing it unconsciously, I actually tried to get out of the conference. I told the organizer I didn't think I could really finish my paper. He said, "Are you crazy? Of course you can finish your paper." And of course I could finish my paper, but I had to want to, and I had to face my fears and my blindness and white blindness to racist practices. When I think as a psychoanalyst about what is it in white consciousness that is a central problem, I would say it is the blankness, the amnesia. And there's an illustration in my paper of this from a psychoanalytic writing. I think the whole notion of fragility, which is a D'Angelo concept, is a kind of complicated notion because it's as though we people who are white are too fragile to actually confront racist practice. I don't think fragility is exactly the right term. I think refusal, disavowal, resistance, amnesia are actually better examples. So in my paper, one of the concepts, one of the practices that I had to face up to was in my own family as the child of colonial architects of racism and the destruction of Indigenous persons in Canada, in Western Canada. I had to notice that in my own house, my grandparents' house that I grew up, and in my own now New York apartment, there are objects which were acquired by my family as part of colonial piracy and just theft of objects, totemic objects of other communities. And I had to look at my willingness to give them back to the places they originated, but my not wanting to. What in me required holding on to somebody else's religious objects? What am I not facing in this kind of practice? So that was one of the things that I was writing about. The other is something from a psychoanalytic text, and I'm just going to take a little minute to talk about it. It's a paper by an English woman, Joan Riviere, published in 1929, and she describes her patient as a Southern woman who grew up in the South and had the following fantasy and dream throughout her childhood. So we have to think in 1929, if she's a woman, we're talking a woman who was a child at the end of the 19th century, one of the heights of Jim Crow. So this is what's in the text, published in 1929 and read by, I can't tell you, every grad student, every analyst in training knows this paper. It's a very well-known, and she was a very prominent psychoanalyst. This fantasy, I'm quoting her now, this fantasy it then appeared had been very common in her childhood and youth, which had been spent in the southern states of America. If a Negro came to attack her, she planned to defend herself by making him kiss her and make love to her, ultimately so that she could then deliver him over to justice. But there was a further determinant of the obsessive behavior. In a dream which had a rather similar content to this childhood fantasy, she was in terror alone in the house. Then a Negro came in and found her washing clothes, with her sleeves rolled up and arms exposed. She resisted him with the secret intention of attracting him sexually, and he began to admire her arms and to caress them and her breasts. I think that is a description of jouissance, the term that Sheldon George uses to describe racist and racial hatred. Now, that article has been published and has been in the psychoanalytic canon for close to a century. And literally, many famous people, Jacques Lacan, Judith Butler, many people read that essay and never commented on why is this young Southern girl having a dream and a fantasy which has lynching at its center. This is, in fact, the totemic scene out of which lynching occurred. There's a very interesting book, I'm not going to remember the author, called On the Courthouse Lawn, which is about lynching. And about lynching being done in public, about photographs of lynching being taken and circulating. And it is this phenomena which then appears blindly in a text which everybody reads. I read it for 10 years, and only in the recent past was I able to actually think what is being said in this clinical example. And so I think it is, for me, a very totemic example of the kind of amnesia which we must actually wake up from, however difficult that is going to be. I think I've probably gone over my 10 minutes. I'm hoping we can have discussions about this. extremely important matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, that was great. And we will have questions for both speakers towards the end of the program. So I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker and cue up the slides, Matt. So our next speaker is Dr. Tynez Jones. Tynez C. Jones received her master's degree in exercise physiology and PhD degree from the School of Education at Iowa State University. Dr. Jones is a researcher for the Science Bound Scholars Program, a premier pre-college through college program that empowers Iowa Black and Indigenous students of color, BIPOC, to pursue degrees and careers in ASTEM, agriculture, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, fields and education. Dr. Jones previously taught as an assistant teaching professor for the Department of Kinesiology and currently teaches a seminar course for ASTEM majors. Her primary teaching and research interests include health equity, physical activity, and exercise training on disease outcomes in BIPOC. She is also passionate about identity development in the retention and academic success of undergraduate STEM majors. Dr. Tynez Jones will give her presentation on her paper, Creating a World for Me, Students of Color Navigating STEM Identity, and how people of color explore their identities within STEM. Dr. Jones.
Well, thank you for URGE team for inviting me to discuss this research on STEM identity. And I just want to say, I hope you guys are having a great time celebrating Black History Month. Celebration is not just for Black people, but it's for us as a country, as a nation, to be able to embrace the contributions of Black people in society, to embrace Black joy, and the Black contribution. So I do hope that we are taking time to spend some time understanding and knowing Black culture and Black society and how it's attributed to what we know as our country today. Next slide. This study that I'm going to talk about was initiated and motivated initially by a conversation that was had with our graduating scholars. And they were wanting to understand and discuss the barriers that negatively impacted their STEM journey. And they wanted to know why wasn't these things taught earlier in their academic journeys, because they played such a prominent role. So one of the ways that our program wanted to address these concerns was to introduce topics in a seminar course that reached and talked about social identity, such as race, gender, socioeconomic status, and sexuality, and the impact that it has on a student's STEM identity. So the question that was asked is, how do first-year students of color use reflection-based activities to understand and make sense of how to negotiate their identities? Next slide. Being STEM professionals, I'm sure that you've seen this pipeline before. It really shows us that there's a leak in the STEM pipeline that begins as early as secondary education, and it impacts underrepresented students, especially women and students of color. In 2018, the National Girls Collaborative Project estimated that about 74% of middle school age girls expressed a high interest in every area of STEM, but by the time they prepared to declare majors in college, only about 0.4% chose engineering and computer science in college. And this is also represented as they move and shift into the workforce. So as you can see here, there are more women than men that are enrolled in undergraduate programs in colleges and universities across the nation. However, few occupy STEM jobs, with the exception of an overrepresentation of women in the health sector. When we look at, on this document, when we look at engineering and computer science, we can see that the numbers are really low and there's an underrepresentation of women. And these numbers are even more dramatic for students or people of color that enter into STEM jobs in the field, which is represented by only about 6 to 8% of that population. Next slide. So we sought to understand, what does it take for students across this dynamic from secondary education to careers to build stronger STEM identities. STEM identities, according to Carlone and Johnson, is how a student perceives themselves as a STEM person and how others perceive them as a STEM person, which is based on specific constructs that consist of competency, performance, and recognition. Now, this is across the board for all STEM students and STEM majors. However, for students of color, what's also taken into consideration is race, gender, and ethnicity, because they play an even dynamic role in how students persist across their college career. So this paper is to highlight, or was used to highlight, some of those experiences that students were having early in their first semester, their second semester of their first year, to show how experiences like this, if happening over time, can snowball to contribute to their departure from STEM. So next slide. So for this research, as far as the methods, I didn't want to go too much into detail because you read the paper, but for the methods section, we wanted to look at Twitter, because Twitter was a dynamic form of a medium to be able to let students have conversations where we were able to merge learning with social media use, so something that they enjoyed doing already. It was also a space for students of color to provide reflections on the weekly learning that they were having by using a specific hashtag for students to connect to one another and to see what ideas people were thinking about. These reflections on Twitter provided opportunities for students to express ideas, to take on new ways of thinking, acting, and being. More than that, there were some affordances that were granted by Twitter, and where students were able to connect, contribute, and share information with their classmates. But beyond that, when we think about connection, we didn't just want them to think about their own ideas, because these were first year students in STEM. So we wanted to connect them to STEM professionals and organizations and groups that were also present on Twitter, but specifically those who were explicitly addressing topics that center marginalized identities. We wanted students to connect to them to see what were the conversations happening amongst those groups, and in what ways did they identify with what was taking place in those conversations. I took this same idea into looking at how I would use theory to help with my analysis, wanting to find theories that would really allow me to center marginalized identities. Next slide. There was not one single theory that I could use that would capture the complexities of students of color and how they shape their identities in STEM. When I sent the paper off for publication, some of the feedback was, why didn't you use critical race theory? And different constructs or theoretical frameworks like that, because they were so foundational. But for this work, I chose to use identity theory as my guiding point, as my primary theory, because it embraced both intersectionality and figure worlds. Had I used something like critical race theory, I would have eventually, because of my student population, had to dissect that even further and look at lat crit or different areas of critical race theory that may not have been as prominent as what I wanted to see. Because one of the things we noted in this project is that there were experiences happening at the intersection of two marginalized identities. And what I mean by that is, if a person was, for example, a Black male and LGBTQ, those are not two marginalized identities. Being Black is a marginalized identity, and LGBTQ is a marginalized identity. But being a male was considered a privileged identity. So we really wanted to look at how were women experiencing these intersections of race and gender as related to their identity in the classroom, especially being in STEM fields. And then for figured worlds as a framework, I wanted to use it to observe how students might co-construct or negotiate their identities within what figure worlds label these what if spaces. So for example, what if STEM opportunities were more equitable? in reaching success? Or what if the playing field was level for reaching STEM success, or for many of our students? Let's go to the next slide. In the findings, I reported 3 Twitter threads where students were able to acknowledge some of the experiences that they were having as it related to STEM learning environments, STEM persistence, and the double bind. As I mentioned previously, STEM identities are not formed in isolation. It takes 2 components. It takes how an individual sees themselves, and it takes how others are perceiving those individuals. Well, for many of these students, they perceive themselves in a positive perspective as STEM people. One of the students even went on to say that they were living proof as students of color that they could be successful in STEM because they had done it up until this point. In this program, they started on their STEM journey as 8th graders, and they went throughout high school through programming. So they had established some sense of being celebrated for their STEM performance, competence, and recognition, and being recognized by their school districts, their principals, their communities as STEM people. However, as these first-year students entered into these college courses, they were being viewed as non-legitimate participants, which resulted in them being ignored, excluded, and isolated by peers, and even some instructors because of their racial and gendered identities. Now, this was a dynamic that we saw was different from their white peers who did not have to navigate STEM based on the stereotypes and discrimination that would be experienced amongst these students. This was also a place of tension for students of color. Being able to negotiate their identities among themselves was very important to them. However, they had to use something to counterbalance those negative experiences they were receiving from the classroom and from their fellow peers. So they began to discuss family support and using the program as a support or seen as family in order to support their journeys across STEM. These spaces also allowed students to see these what if spaces and what it could afford them. And I found through analysis that they began to build solidarity and agency in these spaces through shared experiences that would possibly position them to resist or even confront the perspectives and views of their instructors and peers as they interact with them on an ongoing basis. So we always have to think about when we're shaping STEM identity, it's not a one-time experience. It's multiple experiences that are happening again and again and again that can determine whether or not students will build stronger identities or where negative factors will impact how they see themselves as STEM professionals. Next slide. Lastly, I really wanted to hit on one of your deliverables of complaints. For our first year students, these are the early stages for them, as you can see in the paper, of recognizing and acknowledging the present barriers that exist. These students have not yet shifted into negotiating rather transformative types of resistance, or they're not ready, or they don't understand how to explicitly express their complaints in related to faculty or the student experience that they're having among their peers. And because of this, there's a process for dealing with complaints on issues of equity and diversity and inclusion that students often go through. And these things were put in place to minimize the work that students would have to do or the feelings of exposure that they would have to experience as a result of outcomes of racism. So what students typically do is they inform what we call a liaison, which is usually the person that sits between the student and the faculty member. And for us, this was our program director or our directors of multicultural student success. And they are the ones who typically will be in charge of the reporting. However, we do have online and anonymous reporting through colleges that students can participate in. But again, These things for our first year students are difficult to navigate alone. So having those liaisons put in place are very intentional and specific for ensuring that students are made to feel welcome and included in the classrooms and classroom experience. I think that's it, and I'm over time, but thank you for listening and reading my paper.
Of course, thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Jones. So I'm going to go ahead and get a video queued up for you. This is an inclusivity tip brought to us by, sorry, I forgot where I was. Dakota Lane. So thank you for that. Matt, you can play the video for us.
Hi, I'm Dakota Lane. I am a undergraduate at Loyola University in Chicago. My pronouns are she and they. And I am an undergraduate student studying environmental science and environmental communication.
I'm Vashon Wright. I'm a postdoctoral investigator at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. I'm a geophysicist and a rock physicist. My pronouns are he and him, and we're here to talk about you. And I'm going to ask you some questions, and you'll answer them. And the goal is to talk about why do we use pronouns? And so maybe I'll let you start. Why is it important to include pronouns in our name tags or just use them?
Yeah, it's really important to, first off, make sure that we use those pronouns so that when people come and are speaking about this, that of course they're not misgendering us. And, pronouns are integrated into English language, the foundations of it. When referring to anything, you're going to use a pronoun, whether it be, it or they or he or she or some other form of it. It's, you use a pronoun and you want to make sure that you're using the right ones. So to help with that and make sure you're using the right ones and not potentially misgendering anyone, we use pronouns in name tags and on the ends of emails and things where people can easily see what ours are.
And then what if somebody says to you, well, what if I don't care about what my pronouns are? Why should I use pronouns still?
Well, again, we're really talking about using pronouns for other people and showing respect for other people. You using your own pronouns and making sure your pronouns are well known can help people who don't necessarily or are typically excluded because of their pronouns feel more comfortable and more safe in whatever space you both may be in. Especially for non-binary people who use pronouns of they or some neopronoun. They may not feel comfortable advertising that if they don't know this is a safe space. So by you saying what your pronouns are, whatever they may be, it's going to indicate and make them feel a lot safer.
Let's suppose I don't know what your pronouns are. How do you suggest going about asking people for their pronouns?
It's, of course, read the room and see how, comfortable the person feels. I usually will ask them individually away from a group setting what their pronouns are. Mm-hmm. And just, specific, just ask, I just want to clarify and make sure, I'm using the right pronouns. What are yours? It's a great way to say it. And another great way that a lot of people don't think about is simply listening to close friends or close relatives of that person and what pronouns they're using. Because typically, of course, they would respect those pronouns of that person. So listening, in a group setting of what pronouns they're using for a specific person can also be a little bit of a key indicator of what those pronouns may be if you don't already know.
There's not a lot of Black people in the discipline, or relatively speaking, and there's also not a lot of Black people who are they themselves not cisgendered. And so there is this intersectionality to your identity. And what have your experiences been like dealing with that, and how important is it really for inclusivity and diversity and feeling a part of the geoscience, environmental science?
That's a great question. I would say, of course, it's integral to anything that I do. You know, I think one of the biggest ways that my identity has probably come up within the professional field is, of course, with my hair. For the simple reason of, you know, it's not typically deemed that traditional Black hairstyles are deemed as professional. For someone like me, when entering these fields, number one, is already judged kind of as an unprofessional. It can also add hardship when I go and I say, oh, these are my pronouns and things like that. Depending on, you know, how understanding the person is, or how educated, should I say, the person is on trans issues. Because it seems as if, you know, people will sometimes look at me and say, you know, not only is she, you know, unprofessional, she's also quite demanding, or something along the lines of, you know, that. And, you know, that can be very frustrating, and it can also be very frustrating considering the fact that a lot of our jobs are institutional based, of trying to find a good fit for me, not only making sure that I will be racially accepted and not tokenized as a racial minority for a larger institution, but that I will also, that my gender identity will also not be discriminated against. So, you know, it can sometimes be a real chessboard. And I've gone through quite a few institutions in the area and labs in the area of Chicago, you know, to find my lab homes within Loyola and actually within Chicago as well. But, you know, it can definitely feel like, it can definitely feel a little hopeless at times, although that's never the case. And I think that's also why representation matters so much. Just because if you see someone like you doing it, you know that it is at least possible. So yeah, no, those two, you know, identities of myself definitely intersect in ways that I never thought they would, especially professionally. And I'm just happy that I have been given the opportunity and the strength as well to kind of combat some of those issues, but also to truly find where I am accepted and appreciated.
Thank you for that, Dakota Lane. Really appreciate that. And there's a full 18-minute version of that interview that's available, that will be available on the URGE YouTube channel. So we're going to get into some questions for our panelists. These came from the audience. We won't get to all of them, and if you can keep your answers fairly brief, that would be great. But we know there's a lot to talk about. So this first one is, it's really hard to find your identity in a white male-dominated discipline. How can white mentors, both men and women, support undergraduate and graduate students of color feel a sense of belonging to their department, major, or institution?
Okay, I think that's for me, right?
So it can be, go ahead.
Okay, I think for white mentors, I think they first have to have an awareness of how racism or misogyny or any form of discrimination based on gender and race, how it shows up in the learning space, in the research space. They have to really be aware of how it shows us, because that's the only way they can confront it and recognize it enough to be able to tackle it, right? To be able to have some type of transformational change to occur in those majors and in those fields. I think what most people typically do to get away from that is to say, I didn't know that that was happening, right? And oftentimes students don't have enough agency to confront faculty or departments, or the position, people in positions of power in the workplace, to be able to say, these are the things that's happening in your lab, and this is what's happening in your classroom. So I think for those mentors, they have to be aware, they have to have an understanding of what's happening in their space, and they have to be conscious about the type of space that they're creating for people to work and live in, pretty much. I think when the consciousness is not there, when they are not reflecting on what's happening or what they've done negatively, I think it continues to repeat itself and no action is progressed forward. So they have to be able to acknowledge those things and really be conscious to the type of mentor they're creating themselves to be in those type of spaces.
Could I just answer this a little, not from the position of being a scientist, but from being a teacher of psychology and psychoanalysis? And I would say in our profession, where I'm mostly at NYU and some at the New School, it is often our younger, it's a very hierarchical profession, and when you're old and established, you supposedly have a lot of knowledge. We are absolutely finding in our situations that it is our often junior colleagues, often persons of color, who are in very interesting situations that are new for psychoanalysis, in community settings, not in private practice, and that this new generation, different in terms of gender, ethnicity, race, sexuality, I think are providing a lot of powerful ideas about how to think about the subject, how to do clinical work in the community settings, not so much in the private practice settings. And I think that's a very exciting time for our discipline in psychology and psychoanalysis to be really understanding what the next generation has to teach, and what is being provided, and the ways in which the field is changing in terms of how we work, where we work, what we think of as psychoanalytic work.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that you brought up, Dr. Jones, about people in power playing a strong role in that, and you addressed that too, Dr. Harris, about the sort of the earlier career researchers maybe having more of a role in this as well. But so back to that role of those in power and how they can create a more equitable environment. For instance, how can departments address complaints and reporting if the faculty that's being complained about is on that committee or board designed to address the problem? In other words, how do we make students of color feel safe enough to file complaints in small departments where anonymity is nearly impossible? And that's to both of you.
That is, that is the question, I think, of accountability and of what it would require, it seems to me, of everybody in an academic or science or social science or health science situation, is to actually be willing to take racism seriously. And I think until that happens, there are all kinds of ways in which things don't get handled appropriately, don't get really spoken to. And so I think, to me, there has to be much more education of white scientists and white academics and white social scientists and white doctors, that I think unless this is really seen as something to which all of us who are white persons need to think of ourselves, how to be accountable. And I didn't say this in the first part, but I think a lot of this has to do that we have to actually take up shame in a very different and much more productive way, because normally people get ashamed and they shut down and the whole story just goes offline. And shame has actually got the potential to be a source of creativity, of transformation, if you can sort of manage it, not come apart. And for this, I think we need, various kinds of trainings throughout the academy and medicine.
And Dr. Jones, so one of those ways, though, that maybe there's less formal complaints or more discussions about experiences, especially negative experiences for students of color in STEM, that's one reason why you use the platform Twitter, where it was students were able to feel more comfortable sharing those. Did you want to share any thoughts on how those are being used now, like that kind of forum?
I think one of the things that we're trying to navigate in using Twitter, because it's a public platform, and if anyone used the hashtag or come across the hashtag, they can see the complaints. Part of it is getting students who are novice to Twitter to feel comfortable enough to voice their perspectives. That's very difficult for anyone who's new to some of the social media platforms. They're just not accustomed to saying what they want to say or using their voice in a way that truly represents what they're feeling. And so for most of these, for Twitter as a platform, I think one of the things we're looking at how do we get students to be able to truly share their perspective without reservation in a public space. And that's one of the reasons we kind of had them to connect with other STEM professionals who's doing the work and who's also addressing these marginalized identities, because it shows them that these conversations can be had, right? These are first-year students. They don't always recognize what can be said, what's appropriate to be said. But this was another thing. We also had students who chose to create these mock accounts on Twitter because they didn't want their peers or friends to know the conversations they were having around race, right? They had not even felt comfortable enough to let their white peers who are their followers or friends in these spaces to see them or reflect on them having these conversations in public spaces. So those are different dynamics that you have to look at when you're looking at Twitter as a public space of discourse.
Yeah, certainly. And that gets into the idea of having anonymous reporting too at your institutions as a way for people to report, and also knowing what will happen with that report, who sees it and when, especially when it's hard to tell, or not hard to tell who maybe has made the complaint. So
can I just say this really quick in relation to the people in power also being the ones on the committees or boards, is I think if you truly want to become an advocate for students or an ally for students in creating these communities that are equitable and welcoming and diverse, you have to have enough humility to be able to say, I can do things wrong too. And I have something to learn from you when you launch a complaint against me, right? I think part of being in power is that you don't want to acknowledge that. But we all have flaws and we all mess up. And on any given occasion, you can say the wrong thing. But it's to know that you can learn from those things is what's most important. And then to attempt to learn from those things.
Yes, absolutely. And sorry, I'm just reading. There's so many questions, and I do apologize to everyone. We're not going to get to all of them. But I did want to ask I recognize that white people have asked Black people to do a lot of the heavy lifting in the racial justice efforts, but how, as a white person, we've talked about some of these ways that we can play a very important role, but how can we pick up some of the weight without going, though, too far into the role of the white savior? Like there's a line that you don't want to cross there, right?
I think absolutely one can't be present as the white savior. The question, and it's, I think in my paper, and I hope in my talk, it's a question I don't actually know that there's as yet a positive answer to, which is there the will in white communities of various hierarchies in science or in all of these different mental health, whatever, is there the will to dismantle racism, to actually take it on. And I think there's enormous fear. There's a fear of loss of power, loss of privilege, economic. I mean, there are fears, and there's, I think, amnesia, kind of blind spots. And if I think of this as a psychoanalyst, I think the question is, could there be a discussion at what levels, in what kinds of structures, about systemic racism, without actually talking about what do we get out of it? What does it do to sustain us? And what are we willing to alter? So
I would probably contribute that that for white people and carrying the weight, it really centers around using your voice to speak up, right? And being able to listen. So when you're in white spaces, that's the place to speak up, right? That's the space to push back and to challenge against these dominant ideologies that are presenting themselves in the space, right? That you recognize. And for a white person, when you're in a space with BIPOC people from different communities, that's a space of listening and learning, to learn what it is that we need to do in order to assist this community in moving forward, or the community in moving forward in these spaces that are created for dominant society. So it's kind of twofold. So when you're in the presence on a white space, that's the space you speak up. You're an ally, you're an advocate for people of color. You're not speaking for them, but you're speaking as one who has heard their experiences, and you have some ideas to share on what you possibly can do or your group could do to advance what's happening in those people of color communities and spaces.
Dr. Jones, talking about language made me think about how in psychoanalysis, we are really having to deconstruct how much racism is in the sort of very language of our theories. So Celia Brickman, who's a theorist who's written about psychoanalysis and race, talks about how Freud took the word primitive and began to describe it in various forms of psychopathology and early development. And he was drawing on very racist 19th century ethnographies and anthropologies. And that language still permeates the psychoanalytic canon. So I think the question of the transformation of language and ideology and theory is a part of the deconstruction of racism.
Absolutely. I think the way that a person speaks or communicates or discusses a topic, I think in my work, I use critical discourse analysis. So I wanted to dig deep into not just what people were saying, but how they said what they said, right? And if you do that to white canons or Freud or whoever, you can see explicitly the line or frame from which they come from in speaking these ideas, or what we refer to as ideologies, right? They're dominant ideologies that has persisted from generation to generation. And oftentimes in academia, they're hidden within curriculum. They're hidden in the writing. So they're not explicit. It doesn't say, oh, hate Black people. Oh, see them as being lower on the hierarchy of race, right? But it speaks to those things within it. So we call that a hidden curriculum, where it's hidden within the works. But as you use the critical ideas, you can challenge some of those perspectives, right? And you can speak explicitly to them.
I think you were getting on to this with both of those. Those are great comments. And I think this will be our last question, and we'll have a little bit of announcements right at the end there. But this question goes to both of you. It's important to have policies in place for addressing complaints, but what interventions can we take to prevent these things from happening in the first place? I think you've mentioned a few things already, but do you have more thoughts to add on that?
I guess I would probably say the policies were created because things happened, So I don't know if you can prevent things from happening, but you can continue to confront those things that do happen, right? So sometimes you try to get ahead of things by creating a policy. And for most universities, for example, the policies are so broad, right? You have to really figure out how to use the policy to address the area of complaint that you have, right? But then sometimes those same policies that were used to not advance a certain idea can also be used based on the person who's interpreting the policy. It could be used to create a greater disparity, right? And so I don't know if you can prevent them from happening, but you can definitely quickly confront them when they happen instead of waiting over time, and for classes and classes and classes of students that's having this same experience. You can confront them right away.
And I suppose that as a white person, I can stop myself from doing them, from perpetuating these, even if they're unintentional. But learning more about it certainly helps that. And Dr. Harris, did you have?
I was thinking that in sort of the medical world and the psychological mental health world, there are lots of structures of supervision and contact. And I actually think there needs to be much more of that, perhaps even in our world, in which there are forums and there are private spaces in which people can speak and make complaints, and that there needs to be a much more of a conversation that's ongoing across different levels of our fields and within our communities. And I would say in my analytic institute at NYU, we've built a fair amount of structure for conversation, for people talking together, for common groups, and people helping each other, and that goes between levels and within levels in a way that I think the more of that there is, the more space there is to speculate, to be helped, to talk, the more things will happen.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we thank you both so much for taking your time to here today to discuss these, and thank you for your papers. We look forward to the discussions in the pods, but I'm going to go ahead and hand it off now to Dr. Wright to close out the evening.
Thank you so much. I really got so much from this. Thank you.
So I'd like to say thank you to our speakers. Thank you for everybody for joining us for Racism in Individuals. I look forward to seeing the Twitter discussions and the deliverables. We've been listening to you, and on Wednesday we will send out a message answering some of the questions that we've had in our email inboxes. These will include how best to facilitate pods, how best to do the deliverables. We'll address timing of interviews, closed captioning, which we tried out today. Or Zoom now has 3,000 capacity, so tell everybody. And I hope a lot of people come, so we have to go even higher. So far, we've defined racism. We've spoken about where we fit into the words. And next week, we will talk about how we got to where we got. How did we get here as a discipline, geoscience specifically? We'll talk about how scientific racism influences our lab courses and our fieldwork. And we'll also talk about what has happened over the last 50 years. In essence, we've been trying to diversify our discipline for at least the last 50 years without much success. We'll talk about that. And I look forward to seeing everybody again next week. Before you all go, there's a reason for these inclusivity tips. Today, Dakota Lane suggested that it's important for us to all include our pronouns on our email signatures, on our social media. And they talked about why it's important. One simple thing that we can all do is learn more about pronouns, and we can all, everybody, change our email signatures. We can all have pronoun stickers at our gatherings. We could all do it at AGU. We can all do it on our social media. That is a simple thing to do to make our discipline more inclusive. And it's not just doing it. We can learn more about it and be open to learning more about it. Thank you, everybody. And I really appreciate you guys coming.
Thank you so much.